Britain romanticizes its railways. Steam locomotives on Christmas cards, the Hogwarts Express thundering through Highland glens, heritage lines serving cream teas to tourists who want to pretend it is still 1953. We love our trains, or at least we love the idea of them. But there is another Britain of railways. Platforms where no train has stopped since Harold Wilson was Prime Minister. Signal boxes rotting in farmers' fields with windows smashed and levers rusted solid. Tunnels sealed with concrete as if something inside needed to stay buried. Viaducts standing alone in valleys, their purpose forgotten by everyone except the crows. These are 15 branch lines where the last train pulled away and never came back. I have gone through railway archives and local historical societies and spoken to people who remember standing on those platforms as children. Let us begin with lines where nature has won. The Linton and Barnstaple Railway in Devon opened in 1898 to connect the remote villages of Exmoor to the outside world. It was a narrow gauge line, just 2 feet between the rails, climbing gradients of 1 in 50 through some of the most dramatic scenery in southern England. The problem was that dramatic scenery does not pay the bills. The line closed in 1935, having never turned a profit. That was nearly 90 years ago now. What remains is remarkable. Cheltham Viaduct still stands in a quiet valley, 8 stone arches rising from the woodland floor. Trains have not crossed it since George V was on the throne, but the stonework endures. Volunteers have restored Woody Bay Station and run short trips for visitors, but 19 miles of the original route remain lost beneath oak and ash and hazel. Sometimes failure looks beautiful from a distance. The Somerset and Dorset Joint Railway connected Bath to Bournemouth through the Mendip Hills. Locals called it the slow and dirty. Loyal passengers called it swift and delightful. It climbed to Marsbury Summit at over 800 feet, the highest point on any railway in southern England. The views across the Somerset levels were worth the journey alone. In March 1966, British Rail closed it. 20,000 people turned out to watch the final trains. Railwaymen who had worked the line for decades stood on the platform at Templecombe and wept openly. The photographs survive. Grown men in uniform with tears running down their faces as the last service pulled away. Today, you can walk the cutting at Masbury Summit in perfect silence. Midsummer Norton Station has been preserved by volunteers who refuse to let it disappear entirely. But the route through Bath has vanished under ring roads and housing estates. 20,000 witnesses to a death. And still it happened. Not every closed line becomes a romantic ruin. The Spilsby branch in Lincolnshire ran 4 miles from Fursby Junction to the market town of Spilsby. It opened in 1868 and closed to passengers in 1939. Goods trains continued until 1958, when the sidings finally fell silent. The station building became a tyre depot. The track was lifted and sold for scrap. The route itself disappeared into field margins and garden extensions. If you drive through Spilsby today, there is almost nothing to tell you that trains ever served this town. A single photograph in the local museum shows the last goods train. One photograph. That is all that remains. Some lines do not even get to be romantic ruins. They simply cease to exist. The railway from Rewabon to Barmouth in Wales closed in 1965. It ran through Dolgellau and crossed the Mordash estuary on a wooden trestle bridge with mountain views that rivaled Switzerland. Passengers fell silent as the train crept across the water, with Kader Idris rising in the distance. Today, the trackbed is a walking and cycling path called the Mordash Trail. Thousands of visitors use it every summer. Most have no idea they are walking where trains once ran. The railway was built specifically to show people this beauty. Now the beauty remains, but arriving by train was part of the magic. You cannot recreate that feeling on a bicycle. These lines died relatively peacefully. The ones that follow did not. The Waverley route ran 98 miles from Edinburgh to Carlisle, through the heart of the Scottish borders. It was the last mainline closure in Britain, shutting in January 1969 despite fierce local opposition. The town of Hawick, with a population of 14,000, became the largest community in Britain without a railway station. The local Member of Parliament, David Steele, led protests and petitions. It made no difference. The accountants had decided. In 2015, a 35-mile stretch between Edinburgh and Tweedbank via Glacials reopened. The closure in 1969 had left the Scottish borders without any rail links at all, but the line still stops 30 miles short of Hawick. 55 years after closure, the people of Hawick are still waiting. Politicians call the partial reopening a success. The people of Hawick have a different word for it. The Varsity line connected Oxford and Cambridge, the two great university cities. The journey took 80 minutes. British Rail closed it in stages, with the final section shutting in 1967. Today, if you want to travel from Oxford to Cambridge by train, you must go via London. The journey takes 3 hours. By car, it takes 2.5 hours on a good day, longer when the M25 is congested, which is always. The East-West Rail project is now rebuilding this route. Services between Oxford and Bletchley and Milton Keynes are due to start during 2026, with Chiltern Railways operating the trains. 66 kilometres of new track has been laid, along with signalling and a new station at Winslow. Future plans include building a new railway between Bedford and Cambridge, using part of the original alignment that closed in 1968. They closed it to save money. 60 years later, they are spending billions to reopen it. Someone should have done the arithmetic. The Woodhead route crossed the Pennines between Sheffield and Manchester through a 3-mile tunnel at over 1,000 feet above sea level. In 1954, it became the first main line in Britain to be electrified. Brand new infrastructure, state-of-the-art equipment, a 1,500-volt direct current system, the future of British railways. 27 years later, in 1981, they closed it. The Woodhead Tunnel was sealed. 3 miles of engineering excellence, abandoned in the darkness. Today, electricity cables run through that tunnel. Power passes through. Passengers cannot. We electrified it. We celebrated it. Then we buried it. That is a particular kind of madness. The valleys of South Wales were built by railways. They brought workers in and carried coal out. When the coal industry declined, the railways followed. The town of Ebbw Vale lost its passenger service in 1962. For 46 years, the only way out of the valley was by bus, or by persuading a relative with a car. The line finally reopened in 2008, but a generation grew up in those valleys with no trains at all. 32 new stations and 4 lines have now reopened within 20 miles of each other in South Wales. These include the Abercynon to Aberdare line, the Barry to Bridgend route via Lontwit Major, the Bridgend to Maesteg connection, and the Ebbw Valley Railway via Newbridge. Wales is slowly stitching itself back together. An elderly woman in Tredegar told a local historian that her grandmother never left the valley after the trains stopped. She had visited Barry Island every summer of her life. After 1962, she never went again. The railways brought people to these valleys for the coal. When the coal went, the railways abandoned them. Now some are returning, but the lost decades cannot be recovered. By now you may be wondering who made these decisions, and whether they understood what they were doing. In 1963, Dr. Richard Beeching published a report called The Reshaping of British Railways. It recommended closing 6,000 miles of track and 2,363 stations. That amounted to 55% of stations, 30% of route miles, and the loss of 67,700 British rail jobs. The objective was stemming the large losses being incurred during a period of increasing competition from road transport. The report was commissioned by the Conservative government, and Beeching delivered exactly what they wanted, a blueprint for cuts. The Stainmore line across the High Pennines closed in 1962. the year before the report was published, but it embodied the philosophy that was coming. This line reached 1,370 feet at Stainmore Summit, the highest point on the English railway network. The viaducts at Bella and Deepdale were engineering marvels. After closure, they were demolished for scrap. Someone weighed the steel against the communities it connected. The steel won. The scale of destruction was extraordinary. At its peak in 1950, the British railway system covered around 21,000 miles of track. By 1975, it had shrunk to 12,000 miles and 2,000 stations. More than 4,000 miles of railway and 3,000 stations closed in the decade following the report. That represented a reduction of 25% of route miles and 50% of stations. The newspapers called it the Beeching bombshell. Others called it the Beeching axe. Both names stuck. When lines closed, the infrastructure often disappeared with suspicious speed. Signal boxes were demolished within months. Stations were flattened before preservation groups could organise. Bridges were removed even when local councils asked for them to be retained for road use. Internal memos from British Rail have surfaced discussing methods for preventing the reversal of closures. If you remove the infrastructure, reopening becomes impossible. They did not just close the lines, they salted the earth. Many of the closed lines had run at only a small deficit. Some lines, like the Sunderland to West Hartlepool route, cost only £291 per mile to operate. Closures of such small-scale loss-making lines made little difference to the overall deficit. Beeching rejected all proposals for cost savings that would not make a route profitable. He refused to consider cheaper light railway operations or reduced staffing. The irony is that the busiest commuter routes had always lost the greatest amount of money, but even Beeching realised it would be impractical to close them. Rural communities paid the price for a deficit they did not create. Beeching found that 1/3 of route miles carried just 1% of passengers. Some rural lines had just 9 passengers per train, covering only 10% of costs. His solution was to cut the dead wood and focus on profitable trunk routes. But what looks like dead wood on a spreadsheet often looks like a lifeline to the people who depend on it. The promised bus replacements never materialised in any meaningful way. The creation of the National Bus Company in 1969 brought some coordination to bus services. However, the overall decline in bus services was not arrested, and there was no integration with rail provision. Then, less than 2 decades later, bus services were deregulated, obliterating a key component in Beeching's justification for ceasing rail operations on many lines. Bus services continue to be cut to this day, with public transport provision in large parts of rural and semi-urban Britain being essentially non-existent. The communities were promised alternatives. The alternatives never came. The Great Central was the last mainline railway built in Britain, opening in 1899. It ran from London Marylebone to Sheffield, and it was constructed to continental loading gauge. The tunnels and bridges were built wider and taller than any other British railway, because the Great Central was designed for a future Channel Tunnel connection that would not actually open for another 95 years. In 1966, they closed it. The only railway in Britain built to carry European trains shut down before European integration was even possible. When planners designed High Speed 2, they examined the Great Central route and concluded that if only it still existed, it would have been ideal. They built it for tomorrow, and then they closed it yesterday. High Speed 2 has now spent over £40 billion, up to April 2025. The Transport Secretary described the situation as an appalling mess, stating that billions of pounds of taxpayers' money has been wasted by constant scope changes, ineffective contracts, and bad management. Perhaps we could have avoided some of this if we had kept what we already had. Mid Wales lost nearly every branch line between 1960 and 1965. The Cambrian coast route survived almost by accident, after a newspaper campaign and some fortunate political pressure. But the lines from Rhuabon to Dolgellau, Carmarthen to Aberystwyth, Brecon to Neath, and the Moat Lane junction routes all vanished. A retired farmer near Machynlleth told me his father described it as watching someone cut off your fingers one by one. You kept hoping they would stop before the hand was gone. They did not stop. Wales lost not just railways, but the idea that it deserved to be connected. The closures were brought to a halt in the early 1970s, when it became apparent they were not achieving their purpose. The small amount of money saved by closing railways was outweighed by the congestion and pollution caused by increasing reliance on cars which followed. The 1973 oil crisis proved to be the final end of large-scale railway closures, as it highlighted the problems of relying entirely upon oil-dependent road transport. Too late for thousands of communities, too late for the routes already lifted, too late for the viaducts already demolished. The lesson was learned, but the lesson cost everything. Some closures were policy, others were decisions that could have gone differently. The last three are the ones that haunt. The Hayling Island branch in Hampshire ran just 4 miles from Havant to Hayling Island across a timber trestle bridge over Langston Harbour. Victorian Terrier tank engines worked this line right up until closure in November 1963. Tiny locomotives from the 1870s were still hauling passengers in the age of the Beatles. The photographs from the last day show packed trains and children waving, and adults standing in silence on the platform. Today, the trackbed is a footpath. At low tide, you can see the bridge abutments emerging from the mud. Hayling Island is now accessible only by road. One road. It floods regularly. Ask anyone over 70 on that island about the trains. Watch their faces change. The Ilfracombe branch in North Devon connected Barnstaple to the seaside resort of Ilfracombe. Gradients were so steep that banking engines had to push trains up the hills. Holiday specials brought thousands to the Devon coast every summer. The line closed in 1970. Local authorities assured residents it could reopen when circumstances permitted. The trackbed was lifted. The stations were demolished. The Grand Terminus at Ilfracombe became a supermarket car park. Circumstances never permitted. They never intended them to permit. The promise was designed to fail. The Killin branch in Perthshire ran 5 miles from Killin Junction to the village of Killin on the western shore of Loch Tay. It served a highland community of 700 people. After closure in 1965, the nearest railway station was 30 miles away. Today, the station building at Killin is a private house. If you walk up the drive, you can see where the platform edge runs along what is now a garden border. Ben Lawers rises to the north. Loch Tay stretches silver to the east. The setting is beautiful. The silence is complete. A local historian interviewed an elderly woman in Killin in 2019. She was in her 80s then and had lived in the village her entire life. She told him that she used to hear the train whistle echoing off the loch in the mornings. Now she only hears it in her sleep sometimes, but only in her sleep. There is, however, a flicker of hope in some corners of Britain. The restoration is slow, but it is happening. In Northumberland, the restored line opened on the 15th of December 2024, bringing passenger trains back into service between Ashington and Newcastle with 6 new railway stations. In Fife, the Levenmouth rail link, which closed to passengers in 1969, was reopened in 2024. In Birmingham, the Camp Hill line will reopen to regular passenger services between Kings Norton and Birmingham New Street, via new stations at Pineapple Road, Kings Heath and Moseley Village on the 7th of April 2026. In the Bristol area, the Portishead line will be restored, connecting 50,000 additional people to the network. Core construction begins in 2026, rebuilding 3 miles of track from Pill to Portishead. In the West Midlands, stations at Darlaston and Willenhall were reopened in March 2026. These projects prove it can be done. They also prove how expensive it is to rebuild what should never have been destroyed. A recent study found that a 10% loss in rail access between 1950 and 1980 caused a persistent 3% decline in local population relative to unaffected areas. The places most exposed to the cuts saw 24 percentage points less population growth than the places that were least exposed. The cuts reduced local jobs and shares of skilled workers and young people. This was not just about transport, it was about opportunity. It was about whether young people stayed or left. It was about whether businesses opened or closed. The railways did not just carry passengers, they carried futures. Following volunteer preservation efforts that began in the early 1960s, over 200 heritage and minor railways now exist across Great Britain. Around 22,000 volunteers maintain these lines, with approximately 600 miles of track preserved. That is a small fraction of the roughly 5,000 miles closed under Beeching recommendations. But it is something. It is people refusing to let the memory die. Since the Beeching cuts, road traffic levels have grown significantly. Since privatization in the mid-1990s, there have been record levels of passengers on the railways, owing to a preference for living in smaller towns and rural areas, and in turn commuting longer distances. Rail transport's share of the total passenger transport market was 13% in 1961. It fell to 6% in 1991 and 2001. By 2014, it had recovered to 10%. But the road still carries 86% of the country's goods. The sheer dominance of road transport remains a major challenge for any serious attempt to build a greener, more resilient future. These places exist. The viaducts still stand in valleys where no one walks. The platforms survive behind garden fences. The cuttings have become woodland paths where dog walkers pass without knowing what they are walking through. Britain closed more railway miles in the 1960s than any other European country. France kept its rural lines. Germany kept its rural lines. We chose differently. We chose the car. We chose the road. And 60 years later, we are spending billions trying to undo what cannot be undone. One main criticism of the Beeching report was that it did not think about future changes. It did not consider that populations in many towns would grow. Towns that lost their railways in the 1960s now need them more than ever. Many old railway lines have been built over, making it impossible to reopen them. The land remembers what was there. But the concrete does not care. The stations are still there, converted to houses, turned into cafes, abandoned in fields. They mark where something used to be alive. The land remembers what the timetables have forgotten.